She called me a fat pig at my son's wedding. Those words landed like a thrown glass. They didn't smash, they cut. For a heartbeat, the music stopped in my head, even though the orchestra kept playing. I remember the swell of violins, the glitter on the guests' gowns, and a champagne flute that trembled in someone's hand as if it, too, had heard something unforgivable. The woman who said it was 32 and perfectly polished, her hair like a brushed halo, her smile an automatic curve practiced for cameras. Her name was Jessica Reynolds, now my son's wife, and she had the kind of confidence that was almost engineered. She didn't shout. She let the insult fall into the room like a deliberate pebble in a pond. The ripples spread outward, whispers, little choking laughs, shoes scuffing against marble. For years, I had worked very hard to make myself a background figure at events like this. I wore a navy dress with sleeves because I liked the color and because it didn't demand attention. I still had Thomas's pearl pendant, the one he bought me the summer before he patented his idea, but I hid it beneath my collar. I wanted to be present at Dylan's wedding without being a headline. That had been the whole point of living quietly after Thomas died, to let my son have his life as cleanly as possible, unshadowed by money, scandal, or expectation. So when Jessica dropped that line, it felt like someone had ripped the privacy screen from a window and shoved all of us into bright view. People looked. Dylan went pale. My hand tightened around my clutch until the leather creaked. And then his father, Robert Reynolds, gasped. It wasn't a polite, staged gasp for show. It was the kind that comes when a memory, long dormant, suddenly bangs into the present. He turned, his face changing from amusement to recognition, the way someone recognizes the smell of smoke from a long-closed kitchen. For a second, the room forgot what had happened. Robert's gaze slid from the man with the camera to the person at my elbow, the quiet man I'd come with by invitation, a colleague of a man who had once been famous in financial circles. James Sullivan was sitting beside me. He was well-cut and charcoal, the sort of man who had learned to disappear and be noticed only when necessary. He'd agreed to come because after one sleepless month of rehearsing my courage, I'd decided it would be easier with one calm, familiar face at my side. Robert's eyes landed on James, and I saw the connection click. He knew who James was. Then he looked at me. The silence thickened like syrup poured slowly. People shifted on their chairs. Somewhere, a fork clinked too loud against a plate. "What is she doing here?" Robert said, low enough that only the nearest could hear, but loud enough for my blood to answer. "That's—" He stopped, and the remainder of the sentence hung in the air like an accusation. The moment compressed everything I had hidden for years into the span of a heartbeat. I felt exposed, but not in the way you feel when someone notices your new haircut. This was exposure by association, the notion that someone had finally taken all the careful discretion we'd practiced and pulled at it until the seams showed. I wanted to disappear. I wanted to tell Dylan to stop this, to move, to take me somewhere far from polished glass and white lilies and whispered judgments. Instead, I smiled, the way people smile when they are trying to hold a legacy together. The smile was a small, controlled thing. I didn't shout back. I didn't throw a retort. That would have been theater, and I had spent 15 years avoiding stages. I stood, said something light enough about congratulations, and caught the hem of Jessica's eye. She returned my smile, 1,000 volts bright. I felt the flash of cameras. Somewhere, someone murmured that it had been a mistake to bring me. I pressed my palms to my knees until my knuckles went white and moved toward the shadowed garden, where it smelled of citron and damp soil, and nothing human-made could accuse me. If you've ever been humiliated by family, hit like and tell me in the comments, what would you have done in that moment? A week later, in bed at 2 in the morning, I replayed the scene until it got brittle. People remember some moments as if through a lens and others as if through skin. That night, I felt every inch of my skin prickling with the memory. I thought of Thomas and all the reasons we'd chosen invisibility. I thought of Dylan blinking at a marriage beginning on a note that shouldn't belong to him. Back then, before the patent, before the quiet decisions that built a life I never intended to advertise, my life was a small, steady one. Thomas was an engineer who loved things that moved elegantly. He loved the idea that small parts, placed properly, could make something larger sing. He loved me in a way that had nothing to prove: steady breakfasts on the table, a hand that held mine in crowded rooms, the patient delight he took in the minor household triumphs that make a life. It was one of those half-absurd evenings, 2 late-night coffees and an argument about which hinge was best, that he pivoted the whole future. He'd stay awake for hours drawing on a legal pad, muttering about a mechanism he called a regulator for airflow. It sounded like nonsense to me at first. Then one day he took me into the garage, and there was a prototype. Rough, brass, odd as a child's toy, and clever as a clock. He explained patentable features with that simple engineer's voice, like he was telling me a story about how the wind passes through the trees. We were never people who dreamed of mansions. We liked books and secondhand furniture with history, small vacations that involved a beach and good bread. But Thomas had the persistence of someone who believed that an idea could be shaped until it fit the world like a key. He filed for a patent in his late 30s. Paperwork turned into meetings. Meetings turned into offers. I remember the day the letter came that said terms were acceptable, a number that made me sit down on the kitchen floor and stare at the tile because the world seemed suddenly much bigger than it had been. $25 million was not an abstract figure. It was a life-rewriting moment. It was also, oddly, an invitation. We did not spend like people who had suddenly discovered riches. We agreed, almost instantly, on a plan born of that smallness of spirit we'd always had. Invest wisely, keep the money shielded, and raise Dylan, our most precious, problematic, joyful child, without changing the scaffolding of his adolescent normalcy. We sold, then met with a financial advisor who taught us about diversification and low-profile trust vehicles and the quiet power of compound interest. We learned to let money do its slow work while we continued to live like the family we were. Protecting Dylan became our North Star. He needed friends who didn't like him for what he owned, teachers who saw his curiosity and not a bank account, a childhood without the pressure of expectations. Even after the sale, we kept our apartment in a modest square of the city and our Saturday pancakes at the same diner. When we flew quietly. We kept Thomas's prototype in a drawer during the first years and later had it framed on our study wall like a relic. Privacy, to us, was not pretension, it was safety. Thomas died 6 years after the sale. He left behind a quiet ledger and a woman who had been learning, in small ways, how to manage an estate and hold grief without letting it rule her. There were funeral arrangements and a period of eye-closing quiet when the house seemed too large, and then there was the work of protecting a life that had suddenly felt fragile. I kept our plan. I kept my head down. I let the investments, carefully chosen, diversely spread, continue to grow. James Sullivan came into my life more than a decade later, not as a flashy broker, but as someone who had once worked with Thomas and later with the trustees. He had a way of explaining things as if diffusing them, removing the heat, and making strategy into manageable steps. He could be blunt when necessary and invisible when that served us best. Years of discretion teach you a kind of armor. You learn how to be an island in a room full of people who are currents. You learn to answer with a joke or a quiet observation, never with a headline. Dylan grew up without knowing the scale of what had been left for him. He knew we had some cushion and that his father had once done something clever, but he never saw the spreadsheets or the statements. That was the point. He loved his life undivided. Which is why Jessica's voice at the reception felt like an instrument tuned to make everything audible. She meant it too. It wasn't random cruelty. It was calculated humiliation dressed up as gossip. She could have simply chosen to be cold or distant. She instead chose to push, and in public. I should have been outraged for a different reason. I should have been furious at the crudity of it, at the lack of grace. Instead, what flared first was fear for Dylan, that this would become a stain on his wedding day, that his new bride would begin the marriage on a foundation of contempt and gloating. Mothers don't think of themselves first in moments like that. Our attention clips out toward what threatens our children. I saw in that instant the sort of life a woman like Jessica might want for Dylan, a life of status, of being the center, not the companion. I could understand her hunger and still despise the way she fed it. After the initial shock, after the secret recognition by Robert, the day rewound into a strange choreography. Guests did what guests do. Talk softly about the next course, lift their glasses, try to fill the space with conversation that ignores the fissure. But fissures have a way of widening when you pretend they are not there. People who had been on the fence about me shifted allegiance like boats finding the current. Some looked pointedly at my hands, no diamond, a simple wedding band the size of a promise. Others watched my shoes, as if they could read priority from the arch. Dylan found me later by the service entrance. He was hollow-eyed, as if the weekend's joy had been punctured. He took my hands in his, and for one panicked second, I thought he might break down. Instead, he said, "Mom." Just the single syllable held the weight of a child trying to steady himself. He did not defend his wife with anger. He explained, apologetically, "She doesn't mean. It's complicated. She's under pressure from her parents." His voice trembled between loyalty and an impossible marital diplomacy. "I know it's complicated," I told him, "but whatever it is, we handle it in private, not in the middle of the aisle." He smiled, fragile. "She'll cool. It's a honeymoon thing. People overstep when nerves are high." We pretended to believe it. We went through the motions because weddings are built on the scaffolding of hope. But the morning after, my phone rang at 7. It was Dylan, early and sharp. "Mom," he said, "she sent me something, a photo. I think she hired someone." He didn't have to finish. I knew the look of calculated campaigns, the photographs taken just so, the documents assembled with the aim of ritual humiliation. "I'll come in town," I said. "We need to talk." At lunch, Jessica arrived with a face that said, with perfectly placed innocence, that she was there to mend fences. She sat across from me in a little riverfront bistro where the light came in like a soft apology. The table smelled of lemon, and the river beyond glinted. She ordered iced tea with a slice of lemon like it would deflect heat. But she carried with her the precise air of sovereign intent. "You really shouldn't make a scene," she said, as if lecturing a schoolmate about behavior. I folded my napkin and looked at her. She had the audacity to flatter herself while wielding insult like an edict. People notice when someone doesn't belong. She slipped a photograph across the table. It was a flat, glossy print, the sort of thing a professional could manage. Me at the signing table from 12 years ago, in a courthouse-like room with a pen poised above a contract, Thomas beside me with his hand on the paper. It was a family album shot taken out of context and weaponized. "I found someone who likes to dig around," she said sweetly. "Private investigators are surprisingly thorough. They find what people want hidden." My mouth went dry. I studied the photo as if it were a clue and not proof. The ink on the contract wasn't legible. The room was unfamiliar enough that only someone who knew the shape of the scene could have pulled it. "I didn't give you that," I said calmly. Jessica smiled, a thin line. "No, but others did. I thought you might want to know what people really think of you. It was interesting, the way your husband handled things back then. People remember winners." "You didn't have to say it like that," I said. It was a poor defense to call for decency. She folded her hands and leaned in, that slightly predatory tilt of someone who knows the stakes. "It isn't about you entirely," she continued. "It's about Dylan. You kept secrets, and secrets make for bad marriages. Families destabilize when money is hidden. The Reynolds family would like to protect its investments." "You mean," I wanted to laugh, disdainful and raw, "you mean you want to get to the money?" She didn't deny it. She merely blinked with the polite, engineered hurt of someone who wore offense as armor. "It's not that simple. There are fiduciary matters. There are reputations." The conversation that followed felt like watching a chess match where the opponent had been given the rule book and the pieces, while you still tried to find where the board had been set. She rolled out phrases I'd heard in boardrooms: restructure, consolidate family holdings, transparency for shareholders. They were words for people who live in briefcases and have lawyers on speed dial. A private investigator, she said, had found layers of paperwork and suggested a vulnerability. If Dylan were to sign certain acknowledgments, and if trusts could be re-examined, then the Reynolds family could secure certain protections. It was language meant to make you think this was gentler than a threat. I kept my voice small. "You could have asked me." She tilted her head. "I've tried to be reasonable, but I also need to protect my family. If that makes me mercenary, then fine." "Your family doesn't need protection from me," I said. It wasn't the whole truth. My money was not a weapon I wanted to point at anyone. But in the face of someone who wanted to weaponize even the word protection, my own reticence curdled. The thought of an outside party sifting through years of private records to use them as leverage made something feral rise in me. Not revenge exactly, more like a refusal to watch my son's life be merchant-priced. She tapped the corner of the photograph as if that one action would puncture whatever soft armor of decency I still wore. "People have a right to know who holds their family's fate," she said. "I do not," I stopped. The impulse to go into lecture about law and privacy and the moral obligations of trust managers would have been tedious and likely counterproductive. Jessica leaned back, satisfied. She had made the point. She had made clear that she had options and, presumably, the financial and legal counsel willing to press them. I left the lunch with a hollow, residential kind of nervousness. I had expected some eyebrow-raising from a new in-law now and then, but not a campaign, not illumination via photographs, not the implication that my life-saving discretion would be pried open for examination. I walked back to my car and thought of Thomas, his wry smile, the way he used to say that people either used money as a hammer or as a bridge. He had always preferred bridge. That afternoon, I called James Sullivan. I hadn't called him in months. Our business dealings were low-intensive, managed by trusts and automated dispersals. He answered on the second ring, voice measured. "Emily." "Someone's been digging," I said. The words felt small in my mouth. He was quiet for a long moment. "Do you want me to come down?" "Yes," my voice sharpened at last, "and be discreet about it." He came that evening wearing simple clothes and a face that had learned to hold concern without reaching for drama. He sat in my living room and listened as I told him about the wedding, the insult, the photograph, Jessica's veiled threats. He didn't overreact. He had a way of parsing danger into manageable pieces, of aligning fear into plan. You were right to keep things private, he said finally. There are people who will assume wealth translates to indulgence and entitlement. They will, sooner or later, think they deserve a piece. I didn't expect it to land like this, I said, on a match day for my son. Of course, James said, family disputes can be messy, but you are not defenseless. He suggested a neat set of first steps: document everything, secure current accounts, initiate a quiet review of any recent inquiries into the trusts. He recommended a reputable investigator, Aguilar Private Investigations, just to see how deep Jessica's reach might be. We do this legally, he said. We don't escalate unless we have to. We respond, not provoke. I don't want to provoke, I said. I want to make sure Dylan's life isn't used as a bargaining chip. James nodded. And you want her motives clear. People who go looking like that often have an agenda beyond concern. We'll find out. We put the plan into motion that week. Aguilar did what Aguilar does: found patterns, traced breadcrumbs. Their report came with dry efficiency. Jessica Reynolds had, indeed, commissioned a private investigator. The investigator had assembled a dossier of photographs, public filings, and, curiously, suggested legal avenues to pressure disclosure. He had also, in the margins, hinted at financial moves, options that the Reynolds family could pursue to press for transparency and familial holdings. It was thorough enough to be intimidating, but not definitive enough to be fatal. What the report made plain, however, was motive. The Reynolds family, it turned out, was not monolithic in its wealth. Their wealth was structured and, in their own eyes, fragile. Robert Reynolds was a man who feared loss the way some fear disease. He feared his children's marriages failing, reputations fraying, fortunes splintering. Jessica's actions, if you wanted to be charitable, could be read as a woman trying to secure her place in a family she found herself in. If you wanted to be less patient, they looked like the work of someone prepared to do what she had to do to move upward. Knowing the motive doesn't make the blow softer. It makes strategy possible. We began a quiet countermove: secure records, notify the trustees, and, if needed, prepare for an inquiry. We did not threaten. We did not shout. We took out insurance in the form of documentation and legal preparedness. I hated that it felt like armor again, because armor had a way of rusting a person who prefers to be flesh and thoughtful. But armor is sometimes necessary. A mother learns that quickly. During that same week, Dylan called, again, but this time with the low voice of someone trying to be reasonable for both sides. He told me he loved Jessica, that the marriage still had the soft shock of new vows, but also that she felt besieged by pressure from her parents. They never stopped, he said. They pushed before. They want everything to be tidy and predictable, and that means getting our finances in a place they can control. I thought of the photograph she'd shown, of a pin hovering above a document. It was as if someone had decided to turn the private acts of our past into a currency to be traded. I pictured Dylan confronted with choices he hadn't planned for, choices about loyalty and autonomy and the kind of man he wanted to be. I will not let them use you as a currency, I said, not in my son's life. He paused at that, the line filled with suppressed gratitude and the soft weight of an adult child's understanding. Thank you, he said, but please don't make this another fight between us. I need to handle it without feeling like I'm choosing sides. I know, I said. We will be careful. The next morning, the first letter arrived. Not a lawyer's threat at first, just a request for clarification from a small firm representing the Reynolds family's interests. It asked for an accounting, a list of beneficial interest holders, an explanation of historical transfers. The tone was polite. The content was not. It was the opening move in a legal dance that can end in anything from polite agreement to a bruising public spectacle. I read the letter twice and then put it in a drawer. When James came by that afternoon, we sat at my kitchen table, the table Thomas used to spread patent applications on, and he walked me through a response. Keep it measured, he said. Provide only what is required. Don't invite deeper probing by being voluble. He used phrases like fiduciary duty and privacy protections with an economy that made them feel like practical tools rather than threats. But there was another current under all of it. The Reynolds family didn't just want disclosure, they wanted control. The private investigator's notes hinted that there had been conversations with advisors about restructuring trust language, perhaps in a way that could position Dylan to be more dependent on them. The suggestion of restructure for the child's best interest was the velvet glove over a hand reaching to reallocate power. I lay awake that night thinking of what we had been building, a life designed to let a son live out his chosen path without money tightening its grip. It had been a generous act, and I had believed it to be wise. Now I wondered if generosity could be mistaken for weakness. I wondered if my refusal to be ostentatious had made the life I wanted for Dylan susceptible to candor-seeking predators who saw a secret as a loophole. There was a strange economy to the anger that rose in me. It was not the lust for revenge that a melodramatic story would promise. Instead, it was the quiet, hot insistence that I would not let my son's future be traded without a fight. It was the logistical, ordinary kind of anger that plans phone calls and reads documents and signs affidavits. It smells of coffee at midnight and the paper edges of files. I called a lawyer that night, not Mark Vance, Jessica's polished counsel, but someone James recommended, a woman with a reputation for calm aggressiveness. Her name was Anita Caro, and when she arrived, she did not wear anything dramatic. She smelt faintly of lavender and competence. We laid out the facts. She smiled once, not sweetly, but as a person who had seen the theater many times and believed in the power of careful entrance. Name changes happen in families, she said. People try to rewrite importance when they feel zeroed out. We'll respond. We'll make sure your legacy is respected. That felt, for the first time in days, like armor I could wear without bitterness. It felt like someone handing back a map after hours of stumbling. Yet even as we prepared, a line of old loyalties tugged at me. I had chosen privacy partly because I believed life without headline drama is a better life. I had not wanted this to be a public spectacle. We were taking steps that, if mishandled, could blow out into the sort of scandal Thomas would have hated. He had loved simple truths presented plainly. The idea of our private decisions being dragged into courtrooms and newspapers made my stomach clench. But the other part of me, mother part, guardian part, took the long view. I thought of the future, Dylan's children, his chance to build a life unmarred by a parent's misfortune, the students who would one day receive scholarships, the small grants from the Thomas Fund I had only begun to imagine. I thought of a different kind of legacy, not one that could be used as a bargaining chip, but one that offered a bridge. That is what ultimately decided me, not spite, not revenge, a protective, stubborn love, and the unwillingness to see what we had tamed be turned into leverage. If someone wanted to make me a villain, I would refuse the role. If someone wanted a battle, I would field a defense. The world had taught me that the wrong kind of silence can be a surrender. Thomas had chosen protection when he was alive. Now, in his absence, protecting meant something else. We began to assemble documents, set the trusts in order, and quietly notify a small circle of advisors. We did not shout from rooftops. We did not send threatening letters in ornate envelopes. James and Anita orchestrated a surgical, measured defense. Clarify ownership, restrict access, and, if necessary, bring questions to regulators on our terms rather than under someone else's spotlight. Still, the letter from the small firm had the effect of opening the doors. Once someone pokes a hole, others peer inside. I felt the slow, creeping sensation that privacy, much like a house, needs constant maintenance. You can no more install a privacy law for life than you can prevent a storm. You adapt. You prepare. The week after the wedding, a more formal notice arrived, a filing for an inquiry into past transfers the Reynolds Council alleged might have implications for family holdings. It was black ink on white paper, bureaucratic and cold. It requested documents, interviews, and explanations. The phrase potential conflict of interest danced almost nakedly in the margins. I called Dylan that night and told him. His voice broke only twice. Why would they? Who would start this? People with anxiety about their place in the world, I said. People who think control equals safety. His reply was a student of stoicism. We'll get through it. I don't know how, but we will. I'm sorry this is happening. Don't be, I said. It's not your fault. There was a pause. In the silence, I felt a fierce, careful resolve settle in me like a weight. This was not simply about vindication. It was about making sure a son's name and his future did not become the currency of someone else's ambition. For all the years I tried to teach him the quiet pleasures of a small life, I now found myself forced to bring the full machinery of careful adulthood to bear. The machinery had a cost. It would make us visible. That was the paradox. To preserve privacy, you sometimes need to use light in a way that makes the shadows shift. I had sworn once to keep our wealth out of sight. But the moment someone threatened to translate that privacy into pressure, the calculation changed. In the weeks that followed, the tempo of our days altered. Where I had once been content to let money grow like a secret garden, now I had to clear the paths, prune the overgrown bits, and occasionally stand guard at the gate. James kept his hand quietly on the rudder. Anita prepared responses. Aguilar continued to trace. And then, on a gray Thursday morning, a small headline appeared online, an innocuous 3-line notice in a local business journal. It mentioned that a high-profile inquiry into a set of transfers had been requested by counsel representing interests of a family associated with a known local company. The piece was tasteful. It implied nothing definitive. But as any parent of a newly married child learns, even a tastefully written nothing can create avalanches in the minds of certain people. Dylan rang soon after. "Mom, people are calling," he said. "My office called. Someone from the paper texted me. Jessica is struggling with this." I had to be strong in a way that was not showy. I had to transmit a calm I didn't entirely feel. "We will handle it," I said. "We will make sure the right facts are known." He sighed. "You always make things feel like they can be fixed." "Because they often can be," I said. "Not because we can control every outcome, but because we can control how we prepare and how we respond." He laughed softly, the sound rounding like a bell. "I love you, Mom." "I love you too." That night, after Dylan rang off, I sat at my kitchen table and looked at Thomas's framed prototype on the wall. It caught the lamplight and threw it back in thin, hard lines. People will always try to translate other people's lives into currencies, I thought. They will toss coins into wells and call it investment. But some things are held, quietly, fiercely, not as trophies, but as tools to scaffold a better life. We were about to be judged in a way I'd never wanted. But there was another truth. Sometimes being visible in the right moment is its own kind of dignity. We did not choose exposure for vanity. We did not want to be revenged upon. We sought instead to steer the moment so that it would not break the people we loved. When I turned out the lamp, my reflection in the dark window looked older, steadier. The years of learning to live small had not been wasted. They had been apprenticeship for moments like these. Moments when something needs defending and you have to decide, cleanly and without flourish, how to do it. There was one more move I made before the matter erupted in full. I arranged to meet with Dylan in person and with Jessica too. I wanted, in part, to understand the woman who had called me a name that night. I wanted to see, without counsel present, without photographs on the table, who she was when the cameras were off. I wanted to make one more attempt at a human bridge. The lunch meeting took place at a small bistro near the river, not the same one where they'd shown the photograph, but something quieter. Dylan wanted to keep the space neutral. Jessica arrived a little late, cheeks flushed from the sun and nerves. She had on a dress that read "Wedding Still Ongoing," but there was an edge to her smile that told me she had rehearsed being amiable. We ordered coffee. For a few minutes, the conversation hovered in the polite, how was the weather, how had the honeymoon been planned? Then, with the kind of precision that only grows from repeated performance, she steered us to the subject that mattered. "I don't want to hurt you," she said first, hands folded. "But I worry about being blindsided. I feel excluded." "Exclusion is an awful feeling," I said. "I've been excluded in life in ways that taught me humility, but secrecy and exclusion are not the same thing." She flinched as if I'd struck her, not at the words, but at the implication. "There are ways to be secret without being deceitful," she said. "It's about transparency where it counts." "Transparency is easy when both sides agree what the counts are," I replied. "My husband and I chose a certain way of living because we believed it was best for our son. That is not a moral indictment of anyone else's choices." "Then why hide it? Why not include Dylan in the family finances? Why does everything have to be buried in trusts?" I felt a pressure build under my ribs. It wasn't the accusatory tone that stung so much as the way she framed the right to know as a right to judge. Because we wanted him to learn to be a man under the pressure of inheritance or status. We wanted him to learn to be a man unaffected by the size of an account balance, to see people for themselves, not for a number attached to their name. She studied me hard, as if trying to decide whether my words were confession or defiance. "You call it protection," she said. "Others call it secrecy, and secrecy is the first place where trust dissolves." "Trust isn't a ledger you can balance when it suits you," I answered. "It's something you teach by example. We wanted Dylan to stand on his own feet." She made a little sound, half laugh and half dismissal. Maybe he should know who stands behind him. "I did stand behind him," I said, quietly, so he could take a fall and learn to get back up without a safety net labeled wealth. We spoke like this for a little while longer, two adults circling the same argument in different dialects. Her face softened only a fraction. Then she did something I had not expected. She put her hand flat on the table and, for the first time, spoke of fear that wasn't tactical. "I'm scared my in-laws will cut me out," she said. "If Dylan has resources that his mother keeps secret, then I'm afraid I'll always be second. I don't want to be defined as the woman who married into money and couldn't keep it from being a thing." It was a human sentence layered in sunscreen and entitlement. I believed her fear was real. I also believed it was a fear she had chosen to answer with a sledgehammer. It is strange how fear and ambition can masquerade as courage. We left that lunch with no miracles. The conversation had not bridged the gulf. It had, however, clarified motives. She was not merely cruel for cruelty's sake. She was anxious and ambitious and willing to use legal means she seemed to think of as hygiene rather than weapons. It made me shiver for a different reason. It meant she would not stop until someone stopped her. The next few days unfolded with the peculiar slowness of a storm that begins as a mere wind and then finds its rain. Letters arrived, as I mentioned before, then a formal request for documents, then, more unsettlingly, an outside inquiry from a financial regulator. They used careful, neutral language in their letter. They asked for documentation related to transfers and beneficial ownership interests. They did not ask for drama. But anyone who works with numbers knows the way they can become narratives once printed on official watermarked paper. We moved like careful people. Anita filed a response. James coordinated the trustees. We gathered the papers that told our story, the patent sale documents, the statements showing the diversification of assets, and the way the trusts had been structured for long-term protection. We did not hide anything that the law required us to disclose. We did not feel the need to. What we did feel the need to do was to make sure the truth did not arrive secondhand, exaggerated by a private investigator or a family lawyer with a motive. At the same time, Aguilar found threads that surprised us. The private investigator Jessica had hired had not only taken photographs, he had assembled notes on conversations with advisors who, on paper, had been peripherally involved with the trusts. He had suggested possibilities to the Reynolds Council, ways to request court review, possible angles to argue that a family member's best interests required transparent accounting. It was hypothetical in many places, dangerous in a few. We put together our own file. We documented every contact, every inquiry, every name that had reached toward our privacy. I hated the work. It was all mechanics and proof is an unromantic thing. It eats away at nice illusions, but proof keeps you anchored when others try to float the narrative. As the inquiry deepened, the tempo of our lives quickened. Dylan, who'd started the year thinking about which fishing rod to buy and what kind of dog he might one day have, found himself fielding calls from reporters and from colleagues who used the word conflict with a kind of clinical curiosity that made him wince. Office gossip is a small, territorial beast. It thrives on suggestion. He handled it with the stunned politeness of someone who loves his spouse and does not yet feel equipped to say no to both his mother and his wife at once. We tried, between conference calls and document packages, to keep the ordinary scaffolding of life. I made the same pancakes I had always made. Dylan called in the evenings and sometimes came by the apartment to sit at the small table Thomas had once used as a drafting bench. We talked about dog breeds in moments when legalese threatened to collapse the sky. Those small things kept the world kind in a way lawyers couldn't. The Reynolds family, meanwhile, went public with their representation. Mark Vance was exactly the man I'd imagined when the photographer snapped flattering shots at the reception, suave in a way that read readiness. He sent a formal letter that was crisp enough to fold paper into a claim. They wanted clarity and potential restructuring for the protection of family interests. It was code. Underneath the code beat the intention to insert themselves into decisions that had nothing to do with them other than marriage. For a few weeks, the human cost of such legal maneuvers became visible. Jessica, who had once been all polished charm, began to look frayed, as if the part she had practiced for had started to fall away. Robert's concerns migrated from polite paternalism to an audible fear when he spoke to his friends, repeatedly worrying to anyone who would listen that his family legacy might splinter. Public acquaintances can be cruel in their sympathies. Sympathy can mutate into leverage when offered at the wrong table. We reached a moment when it became clear this would not remain a question of private letters. The regulator wanted interviews. The lawyers on the other side wanted to mediate. There would be depositions, statements, and if we were not careful, headlines. The thought of Thomas's name in a paper, his invention reduced to a paragraph about wealth transfers to trust, made my stomach clench. He had been an engineer who loved quiet things. The last thing he would have wanted was the calculus of his life turned into a TV soundbite. Anita advised mediation as a first step, quieter, contained, with terms that could be negotiated without stepping into the glaring lights of public trial. It was sound counsel and the kind of thing that made people who love process feel better. I agreed to mediation for one reason that felt strangely simple and pure. It was a way to keep Dylan at the center of the discussion and not the subject of it. The day of mediation, the air in the conference room felt recycled and important. There was a long table. A pitcher of water sat near a bowl of lemons, as if they were trying, decoratively, to diffuse stress. Mark Vance arrived with Jessica and an older man who introduced himself as Robert. He looked smaller across the table than he had when he stood in the chapel. James sat on my side. Anita sat to my right. I wore the navy dress because predictability steadied me and because there was no narrative I wanted to feed that day, except sobriety. The mediation opened with polite statements about intentions. "We wish to reach an amicable resolution," Mark said, and he meant it in the way lawyers mean the phrase, as a lead-in to terms. His charm was surgical. Anita was steady. "We are here to ensure the client's interests and privacy are respected. We are also here to protect the welfare of the married couple in question, Dylan and Jessica." They nodded. Jessica's face was a map of emotions, defensiveness, but also a shuttered vulnerability. Robert flicked a glance to his daughter now and then, as if involuntary pride and concern might balance out. Then the negotiation began. It was a strange theater of rationales and demands. Mark unfolded a list of options that read like a menu of control: restructuring, trustee review, shared oversight. He couched each in language about responsibility and protection. He suggested that if the family could have certain assurances, certain formal documented ties, then the Reynolds family would feel more secure about Dylan's future and therefore be willing to contribute to certain joint endeavors. I understood the beneath. They wanted practical leverage. If they could craft structures in which Dylan's interests were tied to theirs, they would gain influence. Influence is the quiet currency of families who are determined to be secure. I thought about the shape of a mother's love. It is strange how protective instincts can lead you to choices that look generous on paper but act like a brick. Would I offer money just to preserve my son's marriage, or was there a way to shield him without enabling mercenary behavior? The questions had the bluntness of someone trying to vet a promise. Is it a bridge, or is it a pen that signs away autonomy? Anita, who had been cooling the room with measured language, turned to me and said softly, "We can settle this in a way that protects Dylan without turning his life into a bargaining table." That's when I made an offer that surprised even me. It was not born of impulse. It had been gestating in the quiet nights when I replayed the reception and then the documents, when the idea of my son's life being priced made me almost ill. I had no wish to see Jessica or her family ruined. Even in anger, I had an aversion to cruelty disguised as justice, but I did want my son protected. "I will offer $5 million, I said. The words left my mouth like something practical. They did not glitter. They landed and waited. $5 million on these terms: permanent separation from my son and his name, a full and immediate resignation from any attempt to restructure or reassign trust interests, a confidentiality agreement, and the relinquishment of claims against my estate regarding these trusts. In exchange, you accept a one-time sum and walk away." There was a silence like a held breath. The room held it. I saw Dylan's jaw quarter tighten, evidence of his internal calculus, and then he looked at me with something like gratitude and embarrassment mixed together. He mouthed, roughly, "Mom." His hand found mine under the table for a heartbeat. It felt small and steady. Mark Vance opened his mouth, paused, and then smiled in a way that had the practiced air of a man who could translate human transactions into his language of precedent. $5 million is significant, he said. "We will need to consider whether that amount satisfies interests beyond Miss Reynolds." Robert cleared his throat. "We never wanted to," he began, and then stopped. He looked at his daughter, as if waiting to see whether she agreed to be the woman the family wished her to be. Jessica stared at me. "Is this a bribe?" she asked. It came out like a challenge. "No," I said. "It is a choice between continuing this conflict in public, who knows where it might go, and making a clean break that protects Dylan from being put in the middle. I am not trying to buy silence for cruelty's sake. I'm paying to protect my son from a life in which his family is constantly bargaining over his personal relationships." Her eyes flashed with complexity, anger, offense, and perhaps a bit of calculation. Mark leaned forward and asked for a short recess. When they returned, the tenor had shifted. Negotiations took on the rhythm of practicalities. Mark asked for more time to speak with his clients. Robert urged caution. Anita held firm on the terms that mattered to me. separation, confidentiality, and the complete relinquishment of claims. There was bargaining, of course. He asked for more money. She wanted certain luxuries addressed. We countered. At one point, someone brought up the idea of supervised joint investments as a compromise, an arrangement I had rejected in principle because it would forever tie Dylan's decisions to their approval. I wanted Dylan to be his own man. Finally, after a few hours and a dozen small shuffles of paper, Mark called back with a terse nod. Jessica, with tears that I could not tell if they were of anger or defeat, agreed to accept an amount that, when rounded, would be close to $5 million, with terms that included a separation agreement, a confidentiality clause, and legal releases of claims. It was not a victory in the vindictive sense. It was a settlement, a practical, adult decision aimed at ending the escalation. Dylan's face was a mixture of shame and relief. He squeezed my hand under the table and said, "Thank you. I'm sorry it had to be like this."
"You're my son," I whispered. "I will always choose you." 2 weeks later, paperwork was filed. Jessica filed for divorce and accepted the settlement. The Reynolds family posted a statement about privacy and respect. The media, which had been watching the edges, covered it as a private settlement, a phrase meant to tame curiosity. In those small legal maneuvers, a chapter closed without sensationalist fireworks. It felt, perversely, like mercy. The aftermath of the settlement was quiet in the public eye and tumultuous privately. There were rumors at first, then a kind of exhaustion. Jessica retreated to her parents' home for a while. Dylan took a leave from work to recalibrate. I kept my phone on at nights because I had learned, late in life, that vigilance is different from obsession. The first keeps you safe. The second eats you alive. What surprised me in the months that followed was less the relief and more the way life rearranged itself into something new and gentler. The plane of our domestic world smoothed as if a stone had been removed from the bed of a river. Dylan began to rebuild, not by erasing the past, but by setting down new expectations. He dated slowly. He reconnected with friends who had been odd and ordinary and kind. He started seeing someone with a laugh that reminded me, irrationally, of summer. Her name was Sarah. She loved bad puns and took to my pancakes without complaint. I liked her. I sold the city apartment that had been our anchor for 2 decades. Not because I needed to, strictly speaking, but because the city had begun to feel like a place where memories wear shoes that pinch. I wanted a place closer to land and light. We found a house in Santa Fe, simple, sun-bleached, with a courtyard garden where rosemary threw its scent like confetti. I had always liked the quality of light there, not harsh, but clean, a light that does not flatter, but tells the truth. Moving felt like stepping into a carefully designed pause. I kept Thomas's framed prototype on the wall of my new study. It looked at me like a small, proud photograph of what persistence can do. In Santa Fe, I rediscovered things I had stored in drawers during the decade of care. The pleasure of a long walk at dawn, the comfort of neighbors who bake bread, and the surprising joy of being known slowly rather than suddenly. But money is not an ending, it is a possibility. I had always promised myself that if the chance came, I would shape our wealth into something that felt like a conversation rather than a conquest. The Thomas Fund was born from that promise. It began small by intention, a local scholarship for students pursuing engineering or trade skills, a grant program for women over 40 starting small businesses, microgrants for artists who needed a studio for 6 months. We focused on pragmatic help, the kind that takes a seed and gives it water rather than headlines. One chilly morning a year after the settlement, I met a young woman named Maria at a community college. She had been awarded a Thomas Fund scholarship to complete a certificate in HVAC technology. She was 28, soft-spoken but fierce. She told me she had once thought that a career in the trades was not for people like her, people who thought they needed a 4-year degree to be respectable. Now she wanted to own a small business, to hire and train other women who wanted to earn a steady pay and independence.
Your husband, this is strange to say, his invention helped me more than he ever could know, she said, and I saw how small acts of help echo. She had read about our history in a local paper and found a thread that linked to her own desire to be steady. I listened more than I spoke. It is the job of someone in my position to listen. I had the money to change some lives in ways that didn't play on social media. To see Maria's face when she talked about saving for tools in a van was to see the actual thing I had hoped to do all along, create bridges. We structured the Thomas Fund to be quiet, like we had tried to live. No large annual gala, no ostentatious checks. Just checks that arrived to people who needed them, small rooms refurbished, an after-school program given a heater. The fund became my way of insisting that money be used for repair rather than spectacle. It was, in a sense, atonement and continuation both. I was not trying to pay for my past, I was trying to invest in a future that avoided the traps that had nearly ensnared my son. Dylan and I rebuilt our relationship, not by erasing the pain of the wedding or the weeks of suspicion, but by letting time do what time does, heal and reveal. He could be angry smartly and succinctly. Anger that is articulate is less draining. He told me, months later, that he had once resented my secrecy. I wanted to know what family I married into, he admitted, but I also see what it spared me. I only wanted you to be free to make mistakes that were yours, I said, not mistakes priced by someone else's ledger. He laughed that bell-like laugh I mentioned earlier and said, I know, and I'm grateful, even if I had to learn how to set boundaries in dramatic fashion. There were other reparations that did not show up on a balance sheet. I made friends with the woman who ran the neighborhood library and helped fund a summer reading program. I volunteered some time mentoring young women interested in trades and small business. I learned how to make an adobe oven in a courtyard that smelt of sage and rosemary. I learned to sit quietly in the morning with no need to be anything but present. There were also moments of remorse. Money made the settlement possible, yes, but it did not make every wound go away. I thought often of Jessica, who had been both antagonist and, at some points, a frightened young woman trying to survive in an aggressive world. Sometimes I feared my choices had been crueler than I intended, that my money had been used as a shield that in its use cut others. The settlement bought safety for my son, but it also bought a life for another woman that was complicated. Grief comes in many shapes. In the privacy of the courtyard, I wrote her a short letter once. No recrimination, no gloating, only a note that acknowledged the mess we had made of things and the hope that she might find a way forward that did not require the destruction of others. I never sent it. Perhaps that was cowardice. Perhaps it was mercy. Some things are better kept as intentions rather than actions. Whenever I tell this story now, people ask the same kinds of questions. Was it worth it? Could you have handled it differently? Did you lose something by not allowing the public to judge? My answer is inevitably unsatisfying because life rarely fits into crisp moral outlines. Yes, it was worth protecting my son. The settlement enabled him to step out of a situation that might otherwise have rippled into a decade of compromise. But yes, I also lost something, an untroubled complacency about privacy, the quiet life we had loved. I had to become visible to protect the invisible. That paradox is not small. I could have chosen different paths. I might have refused to offer money. I might have insisted on fighting until every accusation was aired, and then tried to let the legal process find a balance. I might have instructed the trustees to litigate until their coffers were empty. There are always other roads. Each has its own costs. I chose the road that would give my son a chance at a life not defined by headline battles. I did not choose revenge. I chose a kind of protection that required me to be generous with a part of what Thomas and I had built together. There is one memory that returns to me often when I think about the whole affair. After the settlement, when things had calmed, Dylan and I went for a walk in Santa Fe, down a lane lined with juniper and the kind of light that makes everything look patient. We found a bench and sat. He looked at me and said, "Do you ever regret not telling me?" I did not hesitate.
Sometimes, I admitted. There were nights I thought you might have been better prepared. But then I think of the boy who was allowed to eat pancakes without someone assuming they were payment, who could be awkward in love without it being a headline. There is value in that, too. He mulled it over, then said softly, I think the life you gave me was one I can own. Those words were worth many legal fees and many sleepless nights. They felt like recompense in the only currency that matters in family, the currency of being known and chosen for who you are, not how much someone believes you might inherit. A few months later, at a small ceremony, we inaugurated the first Thomas Fund Scholarship. Maria was there, bright and nervous, and I watched as she hugged Dylan, who had become a man who could both be loved and be loyal to his life's choices. There were no speeches beyond the practical thanks of someone receiving help. There was cake. There was, in the end, that ordinary human thing. People gathered, helped, and moved on. When people ask what I learned, I give them the thing that settled in my bones by the time I had painted my courtyard wall a soft, forgiving color. The lesson is not pious. It is practical and, I hope, a little generous. Privacy is a kind of power. You can use it to hide, or you can use it to protect. But when privacy becomes leverage for others, it is time to decide whether your silence is serving goodness or enabling harm. Power, in my experience, is not well served by flourish. It is better used slowly to build bridges. A scholarship that helps a single mother, funding for a small business that hires 2 trainees, a grant that helps an artist afford a studio for 6 months. Those are small acts that become large in someone's life. They are the opposite of weaponized money. They are what you give when you have learned to be patient. I also learned that dignity is separate from finances. You can walk away from a fight, but you can also stand up for what matters. Choosing peace is not the same as accepting humiliation. Choosing to prosper is not the same as gloating. There is a middle path. It requires stamina, boundaries, and sometimes the willingness to spend money to buy space for love to return to a life. If you're listening because you faced humiliation from family, know that the right response is not always spectacle. Sometimes the right response is measured, legal, and strategic. Other times it is forgiveness. Both options require courage in different currencies. I won't pretend it was perfect. I am not proud of every choice. There were nights I lay awake and thought about the woman's eyes at the lunch table, about the precise cruelty of the words she dropped like stones. I thought of ways the world could have changed so that women wouldn't feel forced to fight one another over status. But we do not live in a perfect world. We live in a world where people make choices under pressure, and sometimes those choices bring hurt. We must decide what kind of people we want to be in response. Now, years later, when I walk through a Santa Fe morning, Maria's coffee cup in hand, or sign a small check for a community classroom, or hear from a young person whose life tilted because of a scholarship, there is a quiet satisfaction that is not about money, but about alignment. Thomas would have liked that. He would have rolled his eyes at the drama and then, in his gentle engineer's way, asked how we could build something that works. I will leave you with a question I often find myself asking when the night comes and the house is quiet. What do you want your silence to be? An absence that hides cowardice, or a shield that protects what you love? The answer will shape every hard choice you face. If this story has touched you, I would love to hear what you would have done in my place. Leave a comment below. And if you want to see more stories like this, stories of quiet struggles, hard choices, and small acts that become big, I have 2 other videos linked here that explore similar journeys. Watch them and tell me what you think. Thank you for listening.